presentation. So I'm honored today to introduce our presenter, Lisa Monantaro from Rochester City Schools in New York. She is the MTSS director there. We're so excited to have you with us today, Lisa. Please take it away.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen. So welcome, everybody. We've got such a nice representation from all across the country and then some. So that's pretty neat. All right, so let me just, it's not letting me, let me just do this. There we go. Ashley, I think you can see my screen. Is that correct?
I can. It looks great. Thanks, Lisa.
All right, perfect. All right, so I'm going to get going here. Let me make sure. So as Ashley said, the title of this presentation is Where Should I Begin? And when I first started in my position a couple of years ago, it was a brand new position. And just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I am in my 36th year in education. I actually started out as a special educator. I was then a reading specialist. I've been an instructional coach. And I retired about 4 years ago, right as COVID was starting to happen. Was the year that I had decided I was going to retire. And even though I had the summer of 2020, I'm going to call it off because it was the first summer I had off in a long time, I didn't stay retired for long. And so I came into this role and thought, oh, this will be something I can do for a couple months. And I'm actually going into my third year in March as the director of MTSS. I have what I would consider a wealth of experience in writing curriculum, actually involved in writing assessments, instruction, and my initial certification when I went into education, my major was in developmental and behavioral disabilities. So that definitely kind of spans a little bit about who I am and what I have brought to this particular position. In terms of today's agenda, though, I have some targets that I will stay hopefully true to. And I divided this session into 4 parts. The first part is going to be answering the question, where should I begin? Well, we started with research, defining what MTSS is so that we could have a vision. Step 2 is around the identification of 6 components of an MTSS. Step 3 was a tool that we use and continue to use to measure our success. Step 4 are the protocols and procedures. And then finally, closure. So hopefully over the span of an hour, I will be able to get through all of that with you. So before I go too much further, I'm going to ask you to have something handy that you can write on. If not, use your own visualization of this. The strategy that I'm going to take you through is a 4-quadrant strategy, and it's a strategy that can be used for note-taking. So you're going to need that. You're going to need some patience because there may be some level of learning that doesn't have full closure, and hopefully just keep a reflective mindset as we are thinking about how we can identify the key components of an MTSS framework. So let's start with step 1. Step 1, as I walk you through this process, I went through the implementation of MTSS, and I want you to consider this example that I'm going to give you as one option. Is it the best option? I don't know. It seems to be working for us, so that's what I plan to share with you. There may be a different process that you decide to follow, but this is where I began. So let's begin with researching, defining, and visioning. Coming into the director role during the height of COVID brought its own set of challenges. However, the New York State Education Department put out this article, and it's called How Learning Happens Messaging Framework. You just have to Google it and you'll see it. The purpose was to provide a shared messaging framework, a starting point for communicating about how learning happens. So in my research, I kept with that. Then I incorporated another resource from NYSED. It was called Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. This resource helped us to focus on a few things. One, having student-centered learning environments that affirm racial, linguistic, and cultural identities. Two, we want to prepare our students for rigor and independent learning. And three, we want to evaluate historically marginalized voices. There are other features within this framework, but along with that, how messaging, the other article that I mentioned, How Learning Happens messaging framework, and the culturally responsive sustaining education framework, I started to incorporate how those features, those components started to kind of fit together under the umbrella of what I believed MTSS was all about. But in my research, I also had to identify what MTSS is.
The next part of the presentation
just a second.
has to do with what MTSS
taped. So let me just get rid of that. And let me go back to sharing my screen for just a second. Sorry about that. So I think you can see that. Is that correct? Ashley, people can see on the screen?
It's still in the smaller size.
Yep, so I'm putting it out to the larger size right now.
Yeah, perfect.
That should go. So I apologize about that. And let me go down to where I'm supposed to be right now. Oops, let me go back.
The next part of the presentation.
This doesn't seem to be the one that I had sent initially, so that's why when I shared my screen, it's popping up.
No
I hope that
worries.
doesn't happen again. Sorry about that. So what I was saying was that our team had to identify what MTSS is and what it is not. And for us, we recognize that MTSS is a framework to implement effective practices. We wanted it to match needs and resources. We wanted it to be a collaborative effort. So not just my department, but all departments, teaching and learning, special education, assessment. We wanted it to be an all students initiative, and we wanted it to be about student progress. But we also had to message that MTSS is not an instructional program.
Lisa, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm still seeing a pop-out box. I don't know if others are. Can you confirm in the chat, folks? Are you seeing the full presentation, or seeing a pop-out box that says all done? You can close this file now.
So let me stop sharing, and maybe I have to.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. You know how it is with technical difficulties. Lisa will be back in just a minute. Oh, great question, Danny. Yeah, what are the temperatures where everybody is today? I shared it snowing here in Massachusetts. Ooh, 37 degrees, Gretel. I know some of our Florida and California friends don't envy you. Snowing here in Boston too, Erica. Yikes, Molly, 17 degrees. You're back, Lisa.
I don't know what happened, but I lost you altogether. So I'll try this one more time.
You're good.
Let me just make sure.
Good.
I'm going to make this low so that I can just pull this up quickly. All right. Sorry about that.
Take your time.
I'm just not as familiar with this platform. I know Zoom and I know Teams really well.
You know, we have all said the same thing, is that we've been so accustomed to Zoom. We know how to work it so well. And this is a new platform to many of us as well. Here we go.
All right. So let's get you where I was. Okay.
Perfect, Lisa. Looks great.
Thank you. So I don't know if you heard what I was saying before, but part of our research was to identify what MTSS is, but also what it is not. And one of the things that we identified is that it is not an instructional program. It's not something I can buy. It's not intended to encourage placement of students. It's not possible to implement alone. It's not a special ed, a gen ed, a Title I, or an enrichment initiative. and it is not about labeling. And that led us to looking at determining what the definition from the state guidance was. So we landed on our definition, which was MTSS focuses on evidence-based practices. It relies on student progress data to inform instructional decisions, and it ensures that each student, based on their unique needs, receives the level and type of support necessary to be successful. And then as we thought about what would we want our vision to be, all kept coming up. And what I mean by that is we wanted to make sure MTSS was grounded in the belief that all students can learn and all school professionals are responsive to the academic, behavioral, and social emotional needs of all students. So this brings us to the reflection activity for our first quadrant. And in this first quadrant, what I want you to think about is how using the MTSS research, definition, and belief will help your school and district-wide systems that align to each category that is found in bold. So when you think about what your district is focused on, is it focused on evidence-based practices? And if so, what does that look like? Does it rely on progress data? If so, what does that mean? Do you make sure that your instructional decisions ensure each student, and when I say each, what do you think I mean, or what do you mean by each student, so that they can receive the supports to be successful? So in that first quadrant, whether it's in your own mental quadrant or actually on a piece of paper, take a moment and just reflect on that. So as I mentioned before, the first step for me anyways, in my process, my journey, was to do a whole lot of research so that I could come up with the definition that we felt falls under the MTSS umbrella, and identifying what that vision would look like. Having that established would lead us to step 2, which was now we have to identify the components. Early on in this work, I discovered a visual, so I have to give full credit to the Lawndale Elementary School in Lawndale, California. What I liked about this visual was it really focused us on what the whole child needs under MTSS. And a whole child, when we talk about children, we're talking about the academics that they need, the behavioral supports that are necessary, and their social and emotional needs. Coming into this role during the height of COVID, the social emotional needs were critical. And so we had to come up with, when you start to look at the outside layers here, strategic use of data to then collaborate with others. And we wanted to make sure what we were doing had equity so that all students, no matter where they live, they are seen, valued, and affirmed. The outermost part of the outermost part of that visual image is just a few of the elements under an MTSS. So again, one of the messages we gave very early on was this is not an all-inclusive list. So even though RTI might be on there, or PBIS, or safe and positive school culture, there are many elements that fall under academics, social emotional learning, and behavioral supports. So the team decided that we were going to focus on 6 components as a way to organize our work as well. So I stumbled across something that looked very similar to this from many state ed agencies across the country. So for the purpose of this professional learning, I'm going to start with 3 of these 6 components: tiers of instruction and intervention, problem-solving processes, and data and evaluation. All the while, I want you to be thinking about how important it is that there be a shared responsibility between the schools and the district, no matter the size. So let's start with multiple tiers of instruction and intervention. Oftentimes we'll see that triangle with the green, yellow, red. The three-tiered instructional or intervention model is a critical element of MTSS. Tier 1 includes the instruction delivered to all students, while Tier 2 includes supplemental instruction or intervention provided to students not meeting those benchmarks. And Tier 3 includes intensive, small group, or individual interventions for students facing significant barriers to learning the skills that are required for school success. It is important to consider academic, behavior, and social emotional instruction and interventions when examining this element. The next component of an MTSS is problem-solving processes. The use of data problem-solving to make educational decisions is a critical element of MTSS. In the Rochester City School District, we use something called DataWise. That's an 8-step process. When we're talking about students during our problem-solving teams, though, we follow pretty much a 4-step process, and I'll go there in just a moment. This includes the use of database problem solving for student outcomes across content areas, grade levels, and tiers, as well as the use of problem solving to address barriers to school-wide implementation of MTSS. While several models for database problem solving exist, the 4-step problem solving approach includes defining a goal and objectives to be obtained for the student, identifying possible reasons why the desired goals are not being attained, developing a plan for and implementing evidence-based strategies to attain the goals, and evaluating the effectiveness of the plan. The third component that I'm going to focus on for this session, or for this section of the session, given the importance of database problem solving within an MTSS model, the need for a data and evaluation system is clear. In order to do database problem solving, school staff need to understand and have access to sources that align with the purposes of assessment, procedures, and protocols for administering assessments, and using data allows school staff to use student data to make educational decisions. In addition to student data, data on the fidelity of MTSS implementation allows school leaders and leadership to examine the current practices and make changes to increase implementation. So this takes us to the second part of our reflection activity. So in that quadrant, there's going to be 2 parts, a 2A and a 2B. In quadrant 3, I want you to think about your school's strengths and challenges regarding data. I want you to think about your school's strengths regarding problem-solving processes and tiers of instruction and intervention. And I want you to just either mentally or physically write down what some of those strengths are, because I think it's important to start with a strengths-based approach and a challenge. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second, Ashley. And the reason that I want to stop sharing my screen is I'd like people to also add some of those strengths or challenges in the chat. And that way I can actually monitor what you're thinking. So just take a couple of minutes to do that. Ashley, I'm going to also pull up the presentation that they have access to, because the one I keep referencing seems to have some time limits to it.
No problem.
Okay.
So share with us in the chat, what are your strengths? What are their school strengths? And maybe some of my branchers can share their experience when they were in schools as well, if you're here. Thanks, everybody.
So when you were in the classroom, clear expectations, what we were using to measure progress. We don't fit the typical model. 80% of your scholars are not in the green. That's, yep. Teachers have the skill base to effectively provide the instruction for struggling students. Lots of valuable data. Make sure you're not just admiring it. We have our district provides schools with a plethora of academic resources to choose from. Data, but the teachers don't dig into it. They may not know what they don't know. Lots of data, struggles, not using it, time built into the master schedule. Yes, if you can make that happen, that's key. Teachers who are willing to be helpful. Sometimes that's true. We have the interventionists, but they are often used for tier 2. We have many resources for teachers. We have a lot of flexibility in resources, but not enough data or teacher buy-in. The entire school that's not at grade level. How to analyze, teaching teachers how to analyze, using data collection methods. All right, so thank you for engaging in that. I do appreciate that. I think it's important that as part of this session, we can kind of get a sense of what others are doing across this country. And sometimes it can affirm like what we are already doing or trying to do. And sometimes we can come away with, oh, I never even thought about that idea. Yeah, I think that, being interventionists, that takes professional learning, right? We can't expect everybody to walk into the role of an interventionist and know what that means. Understanding the tiers is critical. Not a lot of teachers who use tier 1 interventions. They think maybe somebody else will help. We have great intervention programs and time built into our schedule at all buildings. That's huge. Lots of data, many sources. Again, I caution, just don't admire it. Make sure you have action items attached to that data, because then you can go back and measure if the data that you are using improves once you've put together some action items. All right, so I'm going to pause on the chat. Very different depending on the school districts, yes. But I think that's part of the research that I would implore you to think about so that you can come up with what your definition is. And I'm going to share a few other pieces now. So let me go back to my share screen. Just getting kind of used to what I'm doing here. All right. Okay, so I asked you to come up with those challenges and those strengths, right? But there are 3 more components. So in order to really have a strong MTSS, some would argue that all 6 components should work together. However, if you're finding that that's difficult, like I did, we ended up focusing primarily on the problem-solving process. Partly because with COVID, those particular systems and structure got fractured. And so we wanted to start to build our problem-solving processes. And I did that at the tier 1 level, but I also did problem-solving at the other levels as well. As part of that, it took the next component, which was communication and collaboration. Ongoing communication and collaboration are essential for successful implementation of MTSS. Many innovations fail due to a lack of consensus, to a lack of feedback to implementers to support continuous improvement, and do not involve stakeholders in the planning. I would highly encourage you, if you are working in a large district or small, it doesn't matter. Make sure your critical stakeholders have been involved in this work. In addition to including those important stakeholders in planning and providing continuous feedback, it is also important to build the infrastructure to communicate and work with families and other community partners. These practices increase the likelihood that innovative practices will be implemented and sustained. The next component, the 5th one, is capacity building and infrastructure. School-wide capacity and infrastructure are required in order to implement and sustain MTSS. This capacity and infrastructure usually includes ongoing professional development and coaching with an emphasis on database problem solving and multi-tiered instruction and intervention. scheduling that allows staff to plan and implement instruction and intervention, and processes and procedures for engaging in data-based problem solving. Ongoing professional development and coaching with an emphasis on data-based problem solving and multi-tiered instruction and intervention. We want to make sure that schedules allow staff to plan and implement targeted instruction and systems of support. I saw somebody mention that. When you have those schedules, if there's ways that you can have those professional learning communities, that's so helpful. Processes and procedures for engaging in data-based problem solving to establish some of those written practices or policies and implementation guidance, and district building resources available and reviewed annually. The last component is leadership. Now, when I say leadership, I don't mean just your principal. Leadership is key to successful implementation of any large-scale innovation. The building principal, the assistant principal or principals, the school leadership team, your problem-solving team, even your grade level teams, those can be helpful in implementing MTSS at the school level. They engage staff in ongoing professional development for implementing MTSS. They help to plan strategically for MTSS implementation and model a data-based problem-solving process for school improvement. The school principal also supports the implementation of MTSS by communicating a vision and mission for the entire building, providing resources for planning and implementing instruction and intervention, and ensuring that staff have the data needed for data-based problem solving. Leadership is required in all areas, and listed below each of these items, you can see how we have identified some of that. So take a moment and you can just see how we started to break out some of our leadership teams and leadership work. Okay. So from our building capacity and infrastructure component, we provide professional learning. I have 2.5 MTSS coaches that work for me. And I also go into buildings and provide job embedded coaching. I design and deliver professional learning with them. We schedule our meetings in the buildings as often as we can. In fact, this morning I was in 2 different buildings. My coaches are out in buildings right now. We have, under the collaboration and communication component, we have our students that we go into classrooms. We work with staff in all areas, special ed, our bilingual, our administrative. I would say families and community is not where we want it to be, but it's part of our vision as part of our collaboration and communication. We have data meetings where we look at data when we're sitting with our problem-solving teams. Our problem identification, analysis, implementation, and evaluation is part of that database problem-solving process. And we're constantly looking at that 3-tiered model for our academics, our behavior, our social emotional skills, and attendance. So that brings us to the reflection activity in quadrant 2B. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is, using the visual that I shared with you, or the 6 components that I showed you, the overview of those components, what supports are in your system, in your building, that might not be, that you might not have included in quadrant 1. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to give you time right now to just, first of all, think about that, right? I don't want you to just start listing. I really want you to think about what is happening now in your district, in your buildings, when it comes to those 6 components. Maybe you're doing problem solving really, really well. Maybe you're still trying to figure out who should be part of your leadership teams. Maybe you have great interventions, but you're not really sure how to measure the success of those interventions. So I want you to just take a moment right now And then I'll ask you to start. It's called a waterfall strategy. I'll ask you to type in to the chat, but don't hit go until I say go. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do now is I'm going to ask you to just type in your thinking of those 6 components or the visual, and what are the supports that you have in relation to those. And again, you can pick one, you can pick more than one. And then when I say go, you are going to hit enter. Oh, some of you have already done. Yes, we'll do it as a waterfall. So just go ahead and type it in, and when I count to 5, you will hit enter. So on the count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go ahead and hit enter. And then I will be scrolling up and down here in just a second. So I see things like you're in the very beginning stages. Yeah, you're probably like where I was a few years ago, where we did a lot of research. We made a lot of decisions, and I'll get to those in just a moment. You have district commitment. That's huge. You have great interventionists, but you're struggling to show the data. You have those interventionists, but just trying to figure out how to get between different grade levels. You have a district committee. That's important. We had a district committee too. Finding the time to deliver tier 2 without missing core instruction. It's a balancing act. It's not perfect. You've got some great programs with PBIS and academics, attendance, trying to figure it out though still, right? Knowing what those 3 models are, having academic coaches. Outside, I'm an associate principal for 2 buildings, plus a coordinator. You don't have the staff that you spoke of. Well, I have a staff that in a district as large as Rochester City actually doesn't seem like a whole lot. And when I first started, I was almost pretty much alone. I had a couple of retired people that were kind of helping me out. So maybe there's a way to even have we have a large pool of retirees in New York State, this large bubble from a year or 2 ago. Maybe that's a possibility. We need to strengthen our tier 1. No kidding. We're in that same boat, especially when I hear things like 80% of the students aren't learning. That's a tier 1 problem. That's a tier 1 need. So, that message wasn't met with, great positive reception when I first started saying that. But now as people say things out loud, they're like, yeah, I know it's a tier 1. So, maybe the more that you start using that data to recognize, when you think statistically 80, 15, 5, 80% of the students cannot possibly have qualifying conditions for special ed, for example. Statistically, that's impossible. Do they have major gaps because of COVID? Absolutely. Yeah, struggling with the tier 1, they think it's someone else's responsibility. It's really about changing and understanding methods. The methods that we might have learned 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or in my case, more than 30 years ago, might not be the best methods. And so we have to really think creatively, innovatively, and just differently in how we might be delivering and planning, maybe more, bringing in the SEL as part of our day-to-day lessons is also critical. Sometimes you start small to go big. So if you are limited in your staffing, for example, start with small pockets, maybe have demonstration classrooms, maybe do peer coaching. So, what was one of my things? Have a growth mindset, have patience, because there may be some non-closure with this, but it's really about thinking outside the box too. I don't think they think it's someone else's problem. They just think they are doing instruction the correct way. And that's where the data comes into play, because if they are doing something they think is the right way and the data shows it's working, do it. Great. For some reason, make it work. If the data is showing they're not, that might mean we have to explore some other options. So thank you for engaging with me in that. I appreciate it. So let me go back to sharing. Stop sharing. No. I think this was what I did last time, Ashley, as I hit stop sharing audio and video instead of sharing my screen. I think I just discovered that mistake. So let's go back here for now. And I'm going to take you to the third step. And the third step for us was using a tool to measure success. So we did the research, we came up with our definition, we identified 6 components, we knew that's what we wanted to message. Now that we were messaging, providing professional learning, how are we going to measure the success? And that's where, if you're not familiar with this tool, it's called the self-assessment for MTSS. The acronym SAM is what we refer to it as. One of the nice things about the SAM tool is it's actually aligned nicely with those 6 components. You can Google this. It's also, I believe, in many state ed agencies, for example, use this. We found it, discovered it, I think, either through Michigan or Florida state ed or Colorado. So there are several that use the SAM tool. The SAM is supposed to be used to measure school level implementation of an MTSS. For the first year, we tried to look at all of the indicators. My suggestion would be don't do that. It's overwhelming, especially if you are at the beginning stages of implementing an MTSS. The second year, we really focused on problem-solving processes. And this school year, we're also continuing with our problem-solving processes, but we're also measuring leadership and capacity building and infrastructure. What's nice in the SAM tool is you have on this left-hand side, you have these indicators, right? So right now I'm looking at the leadership component or the leadership domain. And in these indicators, I can see what I should be doing in order to be optimizing my implementation. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. The principal is actively involved in and facilitates MTSS implementation. In order to be optimizing, I would be doing all of these things, right? So if it's a 0, they're not actively supporting it. 1 is emerging or developing. The principal communicates an urgent desire to implement MTSS, participates in professional development on MTSS, and is establishing an MTSS vision. To operationalize, you would do this, and the principal actively supports the leadership team and staff to build capacity for implementation. To be optimizing, you would do these 2, and the principal actively supports data-based problem-solving use at the school. Now, I'm not going to walk you through every single leadership indicator. I think there might be 6 of them, but it has been a really good resource and way for us as an MTSS department to measure the success in the buildings. So that when we have a baseline, which is what we did in June with our SAM tool, mid-year, we're coming up on this place of looking back at, well, what have we done to go from, let's say, emerging to operationalizing. So then this next quadrant, what I'm going to ask you to do is I just want you to think about, again, I'm sorry to stop sharing and sharing, but I think it's important for me to also see your chat. I want you to think about why it's important to measure success. Actually, you can just Google self-assessment for MTSS and you will find it. But you want to measure success for motivation, to know if you're doing something well, to celebrate the wins. Yes, to celebrate. progress monitor and reflect. Oh, thanks, whoever just put it in there. Catherine, thank you for adding that. It's in my PowerPoint, but thank you, Ashley. See if you need to adjust things. And for us, that was critical because I mentioned that we started with all of the indicators. Mistake, big mistake. We have around 50 buildings in our district, 50 school buildings. And so trying to do what I did initially, it flopped. And so then we decided we're going to go slow to go fast. So instead of trying to do all of it, let's focus on problem solving. Yeah, we wanted to see what was working to share with everyone. So another method that I use in a district this size is there are oftentimes people identified in building that are in some type of leadership role. It might be the assistant principal, it might be a coach, and it might be a teacher. It could also be a principal. But early on in this process, I wanted to identify some person that could be the liaison between central office and building. And so every month I bring together our MTSS liaisons is what they're called. Now their plates are full. They have lots of other things going on, but this has been a commitment for them. And so they are critical in helping us to really look at what's going well and what is not. I accidentally said going fast to go slow once and realized how true that often was, but the opposite was better. Yeah, we share best practices in management meetings. 15 minutes we call MTSS Spotlight. Ooh, I might steal that, Sharon. I love that. To plan the next steps, to assess, evaluate successes and failures, see what's working to share with everyone. Yeah, and my liaisons are awesome. And so the MTSS liaisons, there's sometimes no filter. They're going to tell me, you got to do this, you've got to do that. And sometimes there are suggestions that, yep, we can go back and we can monitor and adjust it. Sometimes I can't, especially if it's something that might be related to regulation or something like that. But it's an important part of the collaboration and communication component that I mentioned. So even though we're not focused on that component, it kind of spills into some part of what is important in this work. All right, so I'm going to share again. I'm going to make sure I click on the right icon. So this is going to take us to almost the last, but before I do that, I want you to recognize as what I've just shared with you, for me, why else we have a multi-tiered approach, why we want to measure the success of MTSS is because when we have diverse populations and we get the support that they need matched to their need, it's going to help us be successful with our students. So this leads me to the last part of my presentation, and that is step 4. And for this last step, I'm going to walk you through the kind of protocols that we also, my team and I, needed to design, the procedures that had been established and the platform to warehouse for AIS. When I started the position, there was this feeling that MTSS was just about RTI. RTI is one element. AIS is another element under MTSS. But there hadn't been guidance written. There hadn't been anything really done with our RTI information since 2016. So some of what I also had to do was to design the protocols and the procedures and a warehouse for MTSS. And so the first thing we did was we started with a planning guide. And in our planning guide, we had things like those components that I mentioned earlier, a lot of that research that we had done. It was really a way for us to compile as part of what we were planning. And we started that in June of 2021, almost in a very professional looking kind of document, including everything that we could think of that was going to help us with this implementation as part of the planning. Next, we needed to start collaborating with others. We started collaborating with our Office of Assessment. with our teaching and learning departments, primarily I met with in the city in Rochester, we have executive directors for all of our content areas. So I was meeting and working with them on, the tiered interventions, tiered supports for ELA, for literacy language arts, for our bilingual education and world language, for our mathematics. And so that collaborative work plan consisted of all of the people that I wanted to connect with. We have somebody who is involved with our equity to make sure that we have equity across, not just for resources, but the types of intervention and schedules and so those special education. So I had multiple touch points as part of the collaborative work that we were putting together. I highly encourage all of you that come from a district that has a strong strategic plan, align your strategic plan, align the work that you're going to be involved in with the strategic plan, because oftentimes your strategic plan comes with its own measures. And so you should also be looking at how does MTSS fit into the strategic plan? If I just rattled off those 6 components, is there a leadership component in your strategic plan? Is there communication and collaboration as part of your strategic plan? Are there tiers of instruction and intervention or problem solving, community, collaborative work? So just think about how your strategic plan can fit with the work that your MTSS is doing. And then I also created a comprehensive professional development plan. When I first did it, I did it as a 1-year plan because I needed to at least get what we knew we were going to do with our leaders, with our teachers. I needed to start to outline that. So I did it in terms of a 1-year plan, and now we have a multiple year plan. So over the course of time, we can measure whether or not we've actually accomplished what we said we were going to. Our professional learning takes on various methods as well. We use e-learning, we do screencastifys, we do job embedded coaching, we do after school, summer, we go to grade level meetings, we do our problem solving teams where we sit in and observe and give feedback. So we really, our network meetings, we have principal meetings, we have assistant principal meetings, teaching and learning meetings. So we really try to make sure that our professional learning touches multiple areas. So this takes us to the last quadrant. And for this last piece, what I'm going to ask you to do, and just stop sharing in a second, but I'm going to ask you to think about why you need protocols and procedures, or what protocols and procedures do you already have? So what does that look like for you? What are your protocols? What are your procedures that you have in place? And we won't do this as a waterfall. You can just add your thoughts. And if you don't have any, say, you know what, we overlooked that. Or we're so much at the beginning, we don't even know what we don't know yet. So you have MTSS meetings at your sites. Okay. Are you using any protocols at those sites, Michelle? Do you have an agenda, for example, that you use? And that's not meant to micromanage people, but in roles of leadership, whether it's teacher leaders or building administrators, central office, like we should have a sense of what is happening. And so rather than to go to meetings and just have the discussion, we should leave with clear agenda items for action. We need protocols because in an international school setting, we need to establish systems and continuity as the turnover is higher than in other schools. Yep, we have a spreadsheet that monitors. That's a great starting point at the school site. What are some items that should be discussed on the agenda? I would say, sometimes it starts with your curriculum. So like for tier 1 with your grade level teams, starting with, if you have a pacing calendar where students should be, and if not, as a team, talk about like what strategies are you using at that tier 1 level. They're using an MTSS guide for your international school. We are so at the beginning, probably like where I was a few years ago. Us too, handbook being created now. So we actually created a website, an internal website. I could show it to you, but it's internal. But we created a website as a way to warehouse a lot of our protocols and information. So, yes, a website for admin. Our website is open to all teachers and admin. We feel like there's nothing that anyone shouldn't have access to. If you're a Microsoft school district, you could use like a shared drive, or a Google school district, you could use a shared drive, a class notebook, but I think it's really important for you to start thinking in terms of an implementation of this last component, like or this last phase, if you will. So I think that, for us, we started guidance. We started writing guidance last year, a year and a half ago. So we have RTI guidance MTSS guidance that encompasses RTI, AIS, problem solving. At first, we had separate guidance, and then it started to have a lot of overlap. And we're like, we're just going to do one MTSS guidance document. So we've designed, and I didn't share that today because there are lots of layers. And so I really felt like I would show you like how we even began. So I'm going to continue sharing. Some great ideas were shared here, so I appreciate all of that. And as I'm reaching my closure here, I do want to just put out here, for anyone that is interested in reaching out to me, please feel free. I did not use my work email for this professional learning, but feel free to reach out to me at Lisa Montanero, 1988. at gmail.com. I can also be reached through LinkedIn. It's hyperlinked there. And I'm happy if you want to even give me a quick call. I recommend that you texting me first, because I may not answer a call that I don't have a contact with. And so, feel free to do that. And then for closure, I'm just going to bring us back to what I started with, because I do think it's important to start with the end in mind. And so for me, my closure was the most important thing to think about as you are venturing into this journey of MTSS. Make sure that it is focused on these things. Make sure that it's focused on your evidence-based practices. You want research behind it. You want to make sure that it's relying on student progress data to inform instructional decisions, and you want to make sure that it ensures every student, whether they are students with disabilities, ELs, Gen Ed, those who need some type of enrichment, all students based on their unique needs receives the level and type of support necessary to be successful. I don't know, Ashley, if I'm supposed to share the 2 slides at the end, but they are in the slide deck as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go back here, and I hope, I see lots of thank yous. So thank you to all of you for being here too. It was my pleasure to meet all of you sort of virtually, so to speak. I can't see any of your pictures, so you can see me, but I cannot see you. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Lisa, we have a couple questions in our Q&A. One is from an anonymous user. They shared that when they're on campus, they often hear people referring to students as my tier 1, my tier 2 students. Mm-hmm. How do we get people out of that mindset and remind them that they are all our tier 1 students first?
Yeah, I used to teach at a college for over 7 years, and it was called Assessment in Special Ed. That was the name of the course, but it's relevant to all students, right? We should always be using student first language, always. They're not our L students. They're our students who happen to have English as a second language. They are our students with disabilities. They are our students who might need some tier 3 supports, but they're not our tier 3 students. And I think, how do you change that? It's just, I think you have to model it. you have to actually call people out on it. You know, I've had hard conversations sometimes with administrators and say, hey, you know what, if you don't mind, they're students with disabilities. Or, hey, if you don't mind, I'm going to refer to them as students who need tier 3 supports. You know, and you may not change it overnight, but I think, using that student first language is huge. I cringe sometimes when I hear people say, my special ed students. No, they're not special ed first. They're students who just happen to have a qualifying condition that requires additional supports in some fashion.
I feel that so closely to my heart because I worked my entire career in special education as well. And so when you talk about all students, I just think it's such an important thing to remember. And I love how you shared, like, do it through modeling. This user also shared that there's a lot of silos with when we're looking at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And I think it's really important to remind people that the tiers are really a layer, right? Everybody's getting that tier 1, and then maybe there's that additional support that they need too. So the more you can use the visuals and like to shared modeling those things in your discussions, that's going to help shift the mindset, but it's not going to happen overnight.
And I'm still not where I need to be with my use of language. So I tend to say like students who might need enrichment. And I have to remember that shouldn't all students be enriched? Yes, they should be. So I've started to try to remember to frame it as students who might need some acceleration in their learning. So MTSS might also make us think about, when we think of students on a bell curve, for example, we have students who need accelerated supports just as much as we might need to provide some remedial types of supports as well.
That's great. We have Olivia shared, can you explain how MTSS relates deeply to INRS referrals, which I think are how our New Jersey partners refer to special education referrals. They're talking a lot about how there's so much confusion around it.
Yep. So this goes back to the collaboration piece. So we work very closely with our chief of special ed and associate directors and other people who often sit on those CSEs. So they are very much aware of what our AIS protocol looks like. They are very much aware of what our problem solving teams have been going through. So if a student, let's say a parent, makes the referral, right? If there is no paperwork to show what has been done with that student, they will not even consider the student. Now, obviously, if there's some safety, security kinds of things happening, but we're not talking about the norm. We're talking about, sometimes whether it's teachers, administrators, parents just wanting to kind of bypass the system, it'll get kicked back because you have to have the evidence that the student really and truly has the kind of condition and that the needs weren't met in a traditional setting. And I often say, well, what if they've been diagnosed with ADHD? OHI could work. Yep. But just because they're diagnosed with ADHD doesn't mean they have to have a 504 or an IEP. And so we're really trying to shift that, and having, special ed understanding the work we've been involved in is so important, because if they didn't know what the process was leading up to those referrals, they might entertain. I'm not saying they would agree to a classification, but they might just entertain it. But now they are fully on board with, I don't see an AIS plan. I don't see any minutes from any problem solving meetings. I don't see evidence, that certain interventions were done.
Yeah, and it's so important too when you're a special education team trying to look at a referral, you're making really big decisions about a student. You're making really big statements when you're identifying a disability. So having that backlog of what has been tried ensures that you don't duplicate work, right? And that you don't try something that's already been tried and failed, that you can really have a really solid starting point for that student, and that you've really gotten at the heart of what is that student's individual needs and what might their disability be.
Exactly.
I know
I'm at my time, so you got to tell me how am I Do I like, hello, goodbye? Like,
Well, because there's a break starting, we have a couple more questions. Folks are welcome to drop off and start their break, and we'll see you in the next session. But if you want to stick around, there are, we can stay and Lisa can answer a couple more questions if you're able to, Lisa.
sure, I can. I mean, I do see the one from Danielle. I just don't want to, I mean, we have put together a system for storing our evidence. And I know I'm here presenting for Branching Minds, so I don't want to be a conflict of interest, but
It's okay.
so we're using Panorama.
Thank you. There's one other question in the Q&A, and it says, when you're using the SAM, is there a particular domain you would recommend starting with rather than assessing all domains? And I do think that's really important, because when people are feeling so overwhelmed when they're starting this process, where do you start? What's the first thing that you would recommend?
So for us, when I first started, we were all virtual. So part of what we did was I had principals identify who those liaisons were. And so virtually, we were meeting with all of the liaisons over the course of a few weeks, right? And we had a few questions specific to, what kind of interventions are you using? What's happening with problem solving? So just a few of those like component type questions, just to even get a feel. And it became very clear because of COVID, the problem solving teaming structure was very much fractured. People weren't meeting. They weren't discussing students. They weren't even looking at data. I had pockets of where it was happening and then where it wasn't happening. And so that was what led us to start with problem solving. Now, some might have argued, but why didn't you start with tier 1? Mm-hmm. We didn't. Strategically, we did not start with tier 1 because tier 1 can feel very personal because you're talking about somebody's instruction. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes when you're talking about students who might need tier 2 or tier 3, this is not always, but this was my strategy. Sometimes it feels like, well, the student is doing this and the student is doing that. That's what I'm observing. Mm-hmm. So strategically, we went with our problem solving team component because it was a way in to start to uncover and build trust and relationships to get us to tier 1. So in a district this size, if I had just gone into grade level meetings and started having deep conversations, it probably wouldn't have been met with great success. Mm-hmm. So that's why we started with what we did.
That's very relevant. It gave you like an entry point to be able to, you might even have found that staff would look at that data and uncover that themselves, right?
Correct. Really and that's exactly what started happening. And I often say, I don't have history with this district and I don't have future. What I mean by that is, as I said at the beginning, I retired 4 years ago. So I didn't retire from this district. So I don't have the history. And, I know I won't be here forever. So it's like, I don't have the future. So in some ways, it's allowed me to come in and frame my questions in a way that, how would you argue otherwise? So, so I heard you say that 80% of your students are struggling in your classroom. Do you think statistically that might be something we could explore for tier 1? I don't know you. I don't know your history. So I can get away with like posing a question and it forces them to think more about like, well, yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, probably. And so, that's another way, is how are you interacting with the staff who are working with the students that, might be struggling for the remedial piece, but might be struggling because they're not being challenged and accelerated either.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. Those are all the questions we have in the Q&A. Folks, like I said, you can scroll down to grab the PDF slides here. Replays of these videos will be available next week. Thank you again, Lisa. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a little break, and we'll see you in the next session.